So Jonathan Koestlé-Cate is our next speaker. He's an academic, a teacher, who has written very widely on the relationship between contemporary art and the church, particularly in the last sort of 50 years. And his, have you got a copy of your book here?
I didn't bring it, actually.
No,
sorry.
It is called A Fractious Embrace, which I'll leave you with that thought. And Jonathan is, well, on our editorial board of the magazine, so has been involved with data for quite a while too. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Oh, I'm going to see if I can use my little stand here. Yes, that's okay. Well, an unusual place to start. It's very tempting when reflecting on the work of Pierre Soulages at Conques or Jean-Pierre Reynaud at Noirlac to invoke a well-known formula concocted by the British artist Martin Creed: the whole world plus the work equals the whole world. Usually expressed in bright neon across the facade of significant buildings, it's sometimes described as Creed's artistic manifesto. But it's one that prompts ambivalent readings. Some see in it a resigned, almost despairing comment on art's negligible impact upon the world, especially an art of such minimal economy as Creed's tends to be. More positively, however, it could be claimed that Creed's illuminated formula makes an astute theological point. By drawing our attention to what the poet and artist David Jones once called a doctrine of creation as gratuitous, gratuitousness mirrored in artistic creativity itself. The work brings something new into the world, yet remains a part of that world. Yet who is to say that the whole world of the first clause is equal to that of the second, since it is a world altered through creative addition? The world plus the work is still the world, an addition to the world that remains in and part of that world, but it's a larger world, animated and enriched by the imaginative, creative act. Rowan Williams makes a similar point by proposing that art is theological when it enlarges our sense of the world. He says any artist is going to be in the business of showing the world differently. The question is always how that showing creates an environment, a continuous world, in a way that it makes still more difference possible in the world it started from. Or in plainer English, how it communicates sufficiently to enlarge the world. Now, this may well be true of all truly substantial works, but seems more tenuous when applied to those whose appearance in the world is, in a sense, minimal, approaching what, in the work of Jean-Pierre Reynaud, is sometimes referred to as the presque rien, the almost nothing. Now, what is this presque rien? In Reynaud's case, it is an extreme asceticism at the heart of his practice, explored through the use of mundane objects like ceramic tiles and terracotta pots, untiringly repeated as if searching for the universal or the eternal or the absolute, usually within environments cleared of everything superfluous. Now, this same presque rien could determine his window designs for the Abbey of Noirlac, a commission he received in the 1970s from the French Ministry of Culture as part of a restoration program. It's been said of this commission that a mark of its success is how unremarkable and unremarked upon the windows are. Such is the effortlessness of their integration into the fabric of the building. Here, the enlarging of the observable world is so minimal as to be virtually invisible. But what is the nature and source of this minimalism? I would like to suggest it could be loosely situated within a framework of a modern Cistercian aesthetic. Now, I don't make this claim simply because Noirlac is a Cistercian abbey. Later on, I'm going to suggest that Soulages' windows for Conques are equally Cistercian in form, if not intent. Yet Conques was never a Cistercian site. Instead, my supposition is based on a form of minimalism intrinsic to both artists' work, that when applied to an ecclesiastical environment could be said to reflect a Cistercian tradition. Now, there are limits to this assertion, especially regarding artistic intention, but I think it has enough of a basis to be a claim worth making. The Abbey of Noirlac, built in the 12th to 13th century, is one of the principal sites of the monastic tradition known as Cistercian. The French medievalist René Crozet, writing in 1932, described it as a very pure example of extreme Cistercian sobriety, though conceding that much of its original character had been lost over the centuries through misuse and neglect, including all traces of its original grisaille glass. Fragments of Cistercian grisaille survive elsewhere, however, such as here at Aubezine, which gives us an idea of what was originally there. The monks of Noirlac belonged to an order founded on rigor, humility, austerity, and simplicity. Theirs was a devotional vocation reduced to bare essentials. The Cistercians observed the rule of St. Benedict to the letter, said Georges Duby, one of the most influential medieval historians of the 20th century. Their great houses were to be of the utmost simplicity, bare and austere, without decoration or useless ornament, revealing the plain honesty of the architecture. Under St. Bernard, the stringent rules of the Cistercian order enforced a frugal, aesthetic environment in which the windows were to be as rigorously plain as the architecture, colourless, but with some concession to the use of leading to form simple geometric or floral patterns. The project at Noirlac comprises 63 windows of near colourless glass of varying transparency, set within a black grid or grids of varying density. Different grids are employed according to their position within the abbey, whether they're in the church or the chapel or the refectory. In conventional stained glass designs, leading is typically a structural constraint. Here it becomes a compositional device, integral to the work. The grids affect a minimal intervention, sometimes augmented by a modern touch that unsettles the symmetry of the scheme with a visual shift in the overall pattern. Interesting, I think, offsetting of the two sides of the window here. And then finally, each window is bordered by a band of translucent yet opalescent glass, mimicking the alabaster of an earlier age and visually defining a threshold between the opacity of the stone and the transparency of the glass. To what extent, then, can one justify the assumption that what we see in Reynaud's work for Noirlac is Cistercian in character, however well the sparseness of design reflects the Cistercian tradition? Now, Reynaud was recommended for the commission on the basis of the severity and purity of his work, which it was felt admirably suited the rigour of the Cistercian style. At the time, this stringency was most clearly represented by La Maison, a personal project beginning in 1969 to entirely overlay the interior of his house with an austere grid of white tiles. The two projects were very closely connected, both seen as an experimental implementation of lines in the construction of space. Let me just take a drink, I'm getting dry. Now, such simplicity of form has always been the vehicle for his thinking. And in fact, he's even gone so far as to say, in the case of Noirlac, that the extreme asceticism employed corresponded to my idea of the sacred. Reynaud understood that there are times when the artist's almost invisible presence is required, when artistic sensitivity to a site demands the utmost restraint. He was perfectly aware that he could not treat Noirlac as a blank canvas onto which to simply project his ideas, but that he had to work with and alongside a sacred space charged with a symbolic and religious history established long ago. Even so, his approach to Noirlac was informed as much by his own pared-down aesthetic as to any fidelity to Cistercian values. But, as such, Reynaud could not but be seduced by the rigour of the Cistercian order, so in keeping with his own strict sense of asceticism. As such, the presque rien of the resulting designs was no capitulation to historic precedent, but rather a substantial artistic response to the historical and religious tradition of the place. As Inga, who spoke yesterday, has written, at Noirlac, Reynaud's task seemed to be to do a further act of restoration, to add a lost Cistercian touch to the bare space. Georges Duby, for his part, has argued that the work of both Reynaud and Pierre Soulages magnificently captures a sense of genius loci respected by their windows for the abbeys of Noirlac and Conques. He sees them both as the natural inheritors of Cistercian art, or better said, of the Cistercian spirit of dépouillement, austerity, sobriety. Today, a recent publication said, the cycle of stained glass at Noirlac seems perfectly natural. The work was elaborated with a keen sense of the place, without wounding it, in Reynaud's words. Well, Reynaud's minimalist approach to his windows for Noirlac had a decisive influence on subsequent commissions, prefiguring many of the projects that followed, especially those orientated towards what we might call a post-minimalist aesthetic geometry. People like Pierre Soulages, Jean-Pierre Bertrand, or Aurélie Nemours. In particular, it set a precedent for Soulages' far more ambitious experiment for the Romanesque abbey of Sainte-Foy, Conques, in southern France. This was a very substantial request, comprising 104 windows in total, which Soulages determined to treat above all as an architectural and historical problem, if not exactly a theological or religious one. Put simply, the challenge he set himself was the effective organization of light, sympathetic to the 11th century architectural character of the abbey. Soulages chose not to consider what designs or imagery would be appropriate for the space, but what quality of light and atmosphere. The material would come first, the form only much later. From the beginning, therefore, the commission became for him the quest to find a certain light, that is to say, a particular type of glass responsive to the light outside, but emanating, as it were, from the building itself. He said this: I wanted the diffuse transmission of the light to come not from the surface, as with frosted glass, but from the density of the material itself, a living light, you might say, held in the glass itself. It called for a type of glass without color, receptive to natural light, that would complement the organization of light befitting a Romanesque interior. A glass capable of transmuting light, and these are his words, transmuting light into an emotional value, an interiority, a metaphysical quality in accord with the poetry of the architecture and its function as a place of contemplation and meditation. We might add also perhaps of prayer. But it was also to be entirely opaque, prohibiting all exterior views from within, while allowing the passages of great quantities of diffuse light. In other words, an illuminated but enclosed environment created through the use of a white, translucent but not transparent glass. To that end, he made over 300 experiments, working with major stained glass workshops and a master glazier to find, and in the end by necessity invent, a glass that would achieve the desired effect. The result is a milky white glass, translucent but opaque, able to subtly diffuse and modulate light, responsive to the fluctuations of light from dawn to dusk, but without unduly discoloring the natural colours of the stone. Inside, the windows appear luminous, with a radiant and subtle light, not so much a channel for light, but rather a surface of light. And they would produce warm or cool tones, depending on the strength of the natural light. From the outside, on the other hand, the abbey seems hermetically sealed, as if the building refuses all possible intrusion. For this reason, the windows at Conques have been described as vitrailles à deux faces, windows with a double face, windows with two faces, with two sides, the one side related inextricably to the other, yet neither deducible from or reducible to the other. The appearance of the windows from the interior are not only significantly different to their exterior, they are a kind of inversion of each other in colour and texture. This doubling was achieved via dual process of liquefaction and crystallization at high temperatures, creating large and small grains within the glass. This creates opacity, but allows translucency. I don't understand this process at all. I'm sure Caroline has probably a good idea of what that means. Okay, so having achieved the quality of glass suited to his aims, what about the designs themselves? Each window is reduced to a simple composition using glass, leading, and transverse saddle bars, using minimalist repetition with modulated differences throughout the space. Again, as we saw with Reynaud, unlike a conventional stained glass window, where leading and saddle bars are a necessary support for the image, but a kind of visual interference, Soulage's windows rely upon these elements for their structure, their meaning, and their rhythm. They play an aesthetic and compositional, as well as a structural role. And they also turn the windows into horizontal layered polyptychs. What we also see with these windows is that the lightly curving network of leaded lines, arranged in vertical sections, evinces a sense of ascendance and movement, a flow of forces responding to the downward gravitational pull of the massive stone walls. And one other aspect of the design should not be overlooked, particularly since it reveals a striking contrast with Reynaud's ideas. Rather than puncturing the walls with openings onto the outside world, the windows are very much incorporated into the walls as if a continuation of them. And this is achieved by a lack of a metallic framework encircling the glass, separating it from the surrounding stonework. So you can see probably on the right, the glass and the lead just goes directly into the wall. So the windows become walls of light, in another sense to the way we often think of stained glass as a wall of light. In this case, the glass operating as a variation in, but a contiguous element of the structure of the building. And this is an impression, I think, reinforced by their rugged, granulose finish. They're very, in many respects, they're very stone-like in their texture. Now, here we find an important difference of emphasis between the windows by Reynaud and those by Soulage. Both thought it was essential to foster an atmosphere of enclosure, but Reynaud was content to allow the external world, and above all the natural world, to be visible. But for Soulage, it was imperative to totally eliminate the exterior view, to create the sense of an enclosed space free of all external distractions, yet of course open to the light that must necessarily enter the space. Now, what would be useful here would be a little bit of an understanding of Soulage's background. I'm a bit concerned about how these paintings are going to work. Yeah, not well. Maybe better from where you are. Soulages was born in 1919. He's been painting and exhibiting since the 1940s, always abstraction, and most typically using black ink or paint. In the late 1970s, his work underwent a radical shift. From this period onwards, Soulages worked almost exclusively in black pigment, frequently combining canvases to form closely abutting polyptychs. I'll have another picture which I'll show you in a minute, which maybe you'll get a better view. Anyway, the point is this, that Soulages is known as the painter of black. And in fact, as many of his critics have noted, his material is not black paint as such, but light. Light reflected, transformed by, and transmuted through black. The crucial thing about his black paintings from this period is their receptiveness to light. Through a combination of different textures, gouged, scored, smooth, striated, they capture the changing ambient light of their surroundings. For this reason, he coined a neologism to describe them. He called them outre noir, beyond black. Now, on the odd occasions that a text in English can be found on Soulages, this is very often translated as ultra black. But this is a mistranslation that misses the point. It is not the blackness of the works that matters. It is their more or other than blackness. That's a little better, perhaps. It is the way their blackness, without ceasing to be black, reflects and emanates light as a palpable and constantly changing phenomenon, something the viewer cannot fail to notice as they move their eyes over the canvas and move within the space of the work, something which is helped by the fact that his paintings are very frequently hung in the middle of a space rather than on the wall. Encourages kind of movement around them. Now, coming as it did in the midst of his progression towards an increasingly profound engagement with black, Conques might have been seen as a digression in his artistic development. And indeed, when he was given the commission, there were cries of horror that he would fill the abbey with black windows. But this reaction fundamentally misunderstood the importance of light as an integral element of his work. Looking at an image like this, I hope that you can begin to see some kind of comparison can be made between the design of the windows and the outre noir paintings, the one operating as a counterpart to the other. Take this painting, for example. This is from the year prior to the commencement of the commission. This four-canvas polyptych is very typical of the work he was doing at the time. It suggests a very strong formal relationship between the black paintings and the white windows. Again, we see that vertically layered polyptych and the kind of flow of lines across each section. But perhaps we can also draw a more theological comparison. And we can perhaps do so by revisiting an ancient quarrel known as the Koestlé-Cate controversy between two major monastic traditions, Cluniac and Cistercian. Named after its two principal proponents, but not confined to them, it is often symbolized as a doctrinal disagreement between black monks, the Benedictines, and white monks, the Cistercians. This controversy can be seen most clearly in the differences of viewpoint regarding church ornamentation between Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis and Bernard, I suppose I always say that, Bernard, I suppose Bernard, is it, Inga? Bernard, yeah, not Bernard, Bernard. Abbot of the Cistercian Abbey of Clairvaux. These were both 12th century abbots, known to each other. Both produced written testaments in defense of their contrary positions. Now, as an emergent ecclesiastical pictorial form, stained glass was inevitably drawn into this controversy, seen by its defenders as the medium most capable of expressing the concept of God as light, and operating, in Nicholas Temple's words, as a symbolic bridge between the eternal and ineffable realm of the divine spirit and the temporal world of human perceptual experience. For Suger, following the Cluniac tradition, a theology of divine light was well served by colourful, complex, and figurative stained glass, presenting the worshipper with precisely the kind of sensory saturation of the holy place that so concerned Bernard. Suger proudly proclaimed the justifications for his use of costly materials and richly colourful and visually complex glass as works made in honour of God. He argued for art as a spiritual aid, the contemplation of material things acting as a guide to the immaterial. As he put it here, the dull mind rises to truth through that which is material, and in seeing this light is resurrected from its former submersion. Now, Bernard was a monastic reformer. He offers a very different vision of the appropriate aesthetic environment for monastic communities. His most significant objection to art was that it would prove a spiritual distraction, based on his concern that people will admire the beautiful more than they venerate the sacred, or else they will be transfixed by the grotesques and the mythological creatures and voluptuous scenes sculpted on columns and tympana. In his Apologia, Bernard made an important distinction between what he called the small things and the things of greater importance in terms of his censure of art. So the former, the small things, concerned things like intemperate consumption or lavish vestments. The latter, the things of greater importance, included prescriptions against excess in artistic ornamentation. So it was not a condemnation of all art per se, but of luxurious or excessive art. Now, it's important to point out that Bernard and Suger's positions were by no means as black and white as this dispute might seem to suggest. In part, this is because Bernard's views on the aesthetic environment were not as puritanical as is often assumed. Although he certainly displays an iconophobic bias where monastic life is concerned, he does not do so for what he would have called the secular church. Cathedrals, he admits, have to make concessions to the sensuous imagination of the laity. The Cistercian aesthetic that Bernard was instrumental in formulating then sought to eliminate all superfluity and luxury in the name of simplicity. Their space is illuminated by what has been called a luminous nudity, evoking a transcendent purity and humility, a reduction to the essential, and above all, a sense of presence in absence. Now, these strictures demanded an architecture stripped of all artifice and attentive to the subtleties of light, which Helen Zakin argues in her study of French Cistercian grisaille glass was among the most important characteristics of Cistercian architecture. In very simple terms, a Cistercian aesthetic is therefore based upon a triple renunciation of colour, of individual expression, what we might call the hand of the artist, and of figuration, because figuration presents the visible to the detriment of the invisible. In an essay on Cistercian architectural purism, François Boucher argues that the unity of Cistercian architecture, with its purest ideal of austerity, presents us with a tangible monument to their thinking. even if we knew nothing of the Cistercians except their buildings, we would be able to deduce the character of their movement. Boucher goes so far as to propose a kind of Cistercian modernism, where aesthetic ideals might best be characterized by Mies van der Rohe's maxim, less is more. Which brings us handily back to Soulages and Reynaud in the 20th century. Now, as I mentioned before, Conques is not in fact a Cistercian site, although it is often assumed to be one. This is a modern gloss put upon the denuded abbey. Unlike Noirlac, it is still a consecrated space with a monastic community of Benedictine monks. Even so, in a publication specially produced to commemorate the completion of the project, Christian Heck argues that we can, in all conscience and without false comparison, consider the windows of Sainte-Foy to be an example of Cistercian glass. And in a catalogue essay written years before the commission for Conques had even been muted, an insightful critic wrote of the work of Soulages that the work of Soulages cannot but remind us of the rise of Cistercian art and the complete simplicity insisted upon by Bernard of Clairvaux in the face of the sumptuous display of ornaments that Suger considered fit decoration for the house of God. It echoed a judgment made by Duby that Soulages' work could be justifiably nominated Cistercian painting. And he's there referring to perhaps some of the earlier, black works. He certainly didn't say this because of the choice of Soulages for the commission. This was written in 1980. He wrote it for the pared-down spirit of his work that would later seem so admirably suited to the architectural nature of the abbey, resulting in what we could perhaps call a minimalist intervention into a Benedictine space that evokes something of that Cistercian spirit of dépouillement. Now, we must, I realize, be careful with this idea. Why should the pared-down simplicity of Soulages' work, whether in glass or paint, be aligned with anything we might call Cistercian art? Isn't it simply a form of modernist minimalism, deemed suited to the bare austerity of a site like Conques? Well, perhaps. I think in the end what matters more than whether or not Soulages' windows are Cistercian in character is the degree to which they sensitively prioritize the needs of the space. Crucial to Soulages' approach was that, as he declared, I did not want to modify nor add anything to what is already there. Right from the start, he says, I was moved solely by the desire to serve this architecture as it now survives, respecting the purity of the lines and proportions, the modulations in the color of the stone, the organization of the light, the life of such a special place. The ultimate aim of my research was to make these elements visible. Reynaud's attitude very much echoes that of Soulages. He said this, an artist can only consider the making of a window if he fully accepts to be at the service, and in accord with the building. His approach bringing, and these are interesting terms, his approach bringing love, modesty, and decision. Sometimes decision is translated firmness in texts I've seen. My first concern was to intervene with sufficient discretion so as not to clash with the stone. I wanted to approach it and gently place one by one the small glass squares to live the adventure of window making. And actually both Soulages and Reynaud spoke of their commissions for the two abbeys as an adventure in glass. They both used that term. Okay, so just to conclude, there are those who assume that a religious environment will inevitably produce an authentic response from an artist. Michel Fauché, for example, suggests that despite the lack of personal faith among artists like Reynaud and Soulages, the sacred force of churches, abbeys, and cathedrals is such that they impel an artistic response both authentic and profound. Now, I think this is far too simplistic and in some respects demeaning to the efforts made by Soulages and Reynaud in fulfilling the demands and responsibilities for their commissions. Plenty of examples of weak or inadequate solutions could be cited to contradict Fauché's assumption. When artists are invited to create new windows for abbeys, churches and cathedrals, it is often presented as a way of revivifying these ancient buildings with a patina of contemporary relevance. Now, this I think is broadly true of commissions for the cathedrals of Nevers, or Reims, or Zurich, or Cologne. Probably mostly familiar works here, just to take a few significant examples. Solutions have been found here that aim to be faithful to the past through the choice of colours, for example, but also attempting to be resolutely modern. To add an element of the contemporary to a historic monument, these works seem to say, by no means betrays its past or function as a witness to the past, since every epoch invests the architecture it inherits with the visual expressions of its time. In the case of Knoebel, for example, his splintered, fragmented windows appear to, in many ways, hark back to the martyrdom of the cathedral under German bombardment during the First World War. But equally, they respond to its medieval origins, particularly through the choice of colour and the effect of the colourful glass upon the space. Well, even so, there are times when the artist's almost invisible presence is required, when artistic sensitivity to a site demands the utmost restraint, when what is required is the presque rien. And I think in this respect, Noirlac and Conques present a rather different outcome. Neither Soulages nor Reynaud were concerned so much with returning their respective buildings to a pristine authenticity as responding faithfully and sensitively to the abbeys as they now are, but also to the tradition embodied in them architecturally and to some extent theologically. Writing on Soulages, Christian Heck claims that there is nothing neo-medieval about his windows for Conques. They too are resolutely modern, yet they precisely and perfectly conform to their 11th century context. Here at Conques, in Duby's view, the distinction between the modern artist and the ancient site disappears. The integration, he says, is perfect. This is not to suggest that it is inconsequential. It is rather a presque rien that enlarges our understanding and appreciation of that earlier monastic world. Okay, I'll stop there.